First of all, let's talk about the final exam. Right, so final exam is still on the last day of classes, right? But earlier in the semester, before I put it all to a vote, where you all said, or most of you said you want to take it on the last day of classes, I signed us up for a couple of final exam dates. So what I'm doing is I am going to offer these times that we were assigned for our class as an alternative time that you may take the exam. All right, so maybe you were somebody who didn't want to take it on the final class day. You can opt to take it instead on the 19th or the 20th. All right, I just ask that you sign up to do this so I know who to expect. Right, that way on the 16th, if you're missing from class, I'm not going to try to frantically send you an email and say, hey, you're missing the final exam. Right, so sign up is linked on the slide here if you would like to take it on the 19th or 20th. That would give you a couple extra days of study. Maybe you have like 2 or 3 exams on your last day of class and you want to spread them out a little bit. You can spread it out by opting to take my exam at a different time. Right? Otherwise, if I don't see you sign up on this sheet, I'm going to assume that you are all going to be here on December 16th on the last day of class to take that final. Right, if you do opt for a different time, you don't have to be here in class on the last day. You just have to show up to one of these exam times. Any questions there? I feel like we have a very small class today. It's been a very rough Monday. All right. So we're going to pick up on our topic of speciation. All right, so last class period, we talked about different ways that species can arise, different methods of classifying new species. We talked about the biological species concept, which is the most prevalent way of identifying species, and that relies on reproductive isolation. Okay. So we left off on this slide here, where we talked about prezygotic isolating mechanisms, which prevents gametes from ever meeting to form a zygote, as well as post-zygotic isolating mechanisms, where a zygote can actually be created, but for whatever reason, it's just not viable. It's not sustaining, it's not going to sustain life, or it's not going to sustain a population. So we're going to start in by, because we already kind of went over this slide here, we're going to start on the next slides talking about these different methods of reproductive isolation that are prezygotic. The first one we're going to talk about is habitat isolation. We've actually talked quite a lot about this so far, right? This is where there's some sort of geographic barrier preventing contact, right? So I have a nice cartoon image up here of a population of snails. They reached a fork in the road. Half of them went on one side of this chasm. Half of them went on the other side of the chasm. And for whatever reason, they stayed there. These populations never met again. Over many generations, they developed into 2 different species because they were physically isolated by this giant crack in the earth, right? So we can see one species turned out to be lighter and the other species a little bit darker, right? So we've talked about many different examples of this habitat isolation. Maybe there's a mountain range that is barring contact. Maybe it's a river. Something geographical is preventing that. A new one that we haven't talked about, is temporal isolation. So this is where, even though a species probably could physically mate with one another, could interbreed, they don't. And they don't because temporally their mating seasons are different. Right? So crickets, we have a spring field cricket and a fall field cricket. They look the same, they act the same, they theoretically could interbreed with one another, but they don't because their mating seasons are different. One of them mates in the spring, while the other mates in the fall. Right? Temporally, they are reproductively isolated from one another. Right? So this is a great example of temporal isolation. Right? We could think of other examples. Insects are very common in this. Right? So maybe some insects will mate early spring and rely on a certain food source, while other insects will mate later in the spring. That relies on a different food source. Right? Temporally, they are isolated. All right, behaviorally, we can be isolated. Right, so I love this little cartoon image. I don't know if anyone watches Amoeba Sisters. I have to put links at the bottom of my slides, right? This is from the Amoeba Sisters. This is an example of behavioral isolation, right? They're two birds. They probably could interbreed with one another, but they just don't like the type of behaviors presented by the other, right? So this one is singing a country song, and the red bird does not like country. Behaviorally, that's a type of isolation. Right? Maybe it could be in plumage, right? Maybe they like certain plumage feathers over others, right? That's a behavioral choice. Maybe, they do fancy, like the jumping spiders, they do fancy mating dances, right? Maybe the mating dance works with one species of spider, but not the other. Behaviorally, they are reproductively isolated. We can also have mechanical isolation. Right? So this is where size or incompatible genitalia prevents mating, right? The pieces just aren't there, all right? So they are not compatible. So again, I have this nice image here. We have this large frog and this small frog. Even though they might want to breed with one another, physically they cannot. They are incompatible, all right? So that'd be mechanical isolation. And then our last one is gametic isolation. So this is where maybe the gametes could meet one another, but they're not going to fuse together to form a zygote, right? So gametes fail to unite successfully. This is typically in species that perform random mating, right? So they don't know who they're mating with. Think fish that spawn in a pond, releasing their gametes into the water, hoping that it finds another gamete to fuse with, or plants, their pollen, right? Maybe they're wind pollinated, they let the wind find another pollen spore or find another petal, or plant, right? They don't know who they're mating with. So if a zygote, or if, a gamete matches with another gamete, maybe they're just incompatible. Maybe they were different species, and even if they were to try to unite, they couldn't, right? Maybe their genetics is completely different. All right, so all these different types of pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms, where the gametes physically cannot fuse to form a zygote. All right, so lots of different examples here. But sometimes gametes actually can fuse together to form a zygote, even if they're from different species. This is not very common, all right? So these post-zygotic isolating mechanisms are not common. It takes a lot of time and energy and investment into finding a mate, right? You don't want to waste all those resources in finding a mate to find out that you physically cannot produce offspring, right? You're just incompatible because you're different species. So these would be post-zygotic isolating mechanisms, less common because we don't want to spend all that time and effort for no result. So when zygotes actually do form, when the gametes do meet, they can form what's called a hybrid inviability, meaning they can form a zygote, they can form an embryo, but that embryo is never going to be born, right? It's not going to live long enough to be born, to hatch out of an egg, whatever it might be. So we can form a zygote, and it'll stay a zygote, stay an embryo, and die as an embryo. We could, in this next scenario, which is known as hybrid sterility, have two gametes that meet each other, they fuse, they form a zygote, they form an embryo, and actually produce an offspring. But the offspring is sterile. So a really good example of this, right, is a mule, which is where the male donkey and a female horse, they will mate, they will produce an offspring, produce a mule, but the mule itself is sterile. The mule cannot reproduce. It does not have that ability, right? So because this mule cannot reproduce, therefore it can't grow a population, right? This is not a viable option for making a new species, right? Or this is how we are reproductively isolated. Right? two different species, they create an offspring, but the offspring itself is never going to produce offspring. And finally, we can have hybrid breakdown, right? So this is where two species, right, the gametes fuse, we form a zygote, form an embryo, offspring is born. That offspring can actually reproduce itself, right? But there are so many genetic abnormalities that even if you were to start a population of these individuals, that population would not be successful, right? That population would eventually die out because the genetics is just not beneficial for them. All right, so these are three different ways that we can have reproductive isolation post-zygotically, right? So even if an offspring were to occur, we still consider it reproductive isolation because it's just not a viable method of producing offspring. All right, so again, all this relates to the biological species concept, where we are focusing on reproductive isolation. But there are some problems with just using this concept, right? First of all, reproductive isolation, we can't apply this concept to extinct species or to fossils, right? We don't know, looking at the fossil record, if there was some sort of temporal separation. Or maybe there was some behavioral differences that we can't see because they're not alive anymore, right? We can't observe it. And finally, this only applies to species that reproduce sexually. Asexual species, we cannot apply this concept. And finally, this concept can really only be applied to species that overlap geographically. So where their populations might come in contact with each other at some point, right? Really good example of that is the grizzly bear and the polar bear, right? They're two different species, we know this, right? But when their ranges overlap, they can produce an offspring known as like a hybrid growler bear, right? This bear is perfectly healthy, perfectly normal. It can have offspring itself, right? So according to the biological species concept, we would have to consider the grizzly and the polar bear to be one species because they can produce offspring that is perfectly healthy, right? But we know they're different species. We know the grizzly bear is different from the polar bear. They have different morphological features, right? Their face shapes are completely different, right? They have different habitats for most of the time. They might hunt a little differently. They might have different behavioral patterns. We know they're different. So in this case, the biological species concept doesn't quite work. We have to use a different concept of identifying out individuals. And in this manner, we might use something that's more morphological in nature, right? So what does it physically look like? All right, I have given you a scenario, and I want you to answer these three questions about our dragonfly species, and then we will reconvene. Yes.
Yeah, well, you can't use other species.
But I have not finished reading. I will put it up for copies. So I just put mine. Yeah.
Yes.
I also saw you a copy of the content check, but not the digital.
Did I forget to submit?
I have not graded the digital copies yet, so you are still in the clear if you want to submit.
No, yeah, I turned in the paper one and then.
Yeah.
I will do that now. Thank you so much.
No shot.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that.
It should have never lied.
Yeah.
Anyways, I know it was you that pulled the phone.
Me?
I can hear your flip-flop. I can hear your flip-flop from down the hall.
Do you want to know what I was doing with Fire Love Yep? Hold on.
All right, I have given you a scenario of dragonflies, right? The males have some specialized genitalia structure that prevents them from mating from females of a different species. What type of speciation, or what type of reproductive isolation is this? Mechanical. Yeah, this is mechanical isolation, right? They're just not compatible with one another. So is this an example of pre or post-zygotic isolation? Pre, yeah, prevents the formation of a zygote. Does that mean the species will not or cannot mate? Yeah, they physically cannot mate, right? It's not a behavioral thing, it's not a temporal thing. It's a physical, mechanical, they cannot mate. All right, any questions? All right, there's one more topic of speciation that we are going to talk about. And this is different methods by which it can arise, and it kind of plays into what we've already talked about, right? So speciation arises when genetic changes in a particular group have accumulated to the point where they're no longer compatible with their original population or with their other group, right? They become so different that we consider them a different species, right? Now, there's two different ways that this can occur, right? First of all, we can have speciation due to some sort of abrupt event that causes reproductive isolation, right? Maybe this is maybe it flooded, right? A flash flood created new areas of habitat or isolated a population into two different areas, right? Maybe it was a windstorm and it blew half of the birds off course, right? And they left the original population. But speciation can also arise just due to adaptation to different ecological niches. So when I say niche, I mean the role of an organism in its environment, in its community, right? So maybe it's a physical role. So maybe they are physically taking up space by building a nest in a tree versus on the ground, right? Maybe it's a way that they forage for food. Maybe they fill the niche of eating the bugs out of a log versus eating the bugs on the log, right? They're performing some sort of role in the environment unique to how they live. That is their niche. All right, so if we look at these two ways that speciation can occur, right? Abrupt events or consequences of adaptation to their environment. No matter which way it arises, we would call this cladogenesis, right? So this is where we have one species. That one species now becomes two different species. So in my example up here in my image, I have one species of bird, right? That same species still lives, but it's diverged into having a second species with different colors and different tail lengths, right? So in order for speciation or cladogenesis to arise, we need to stop gene flow between two populations. We need to isolate out two populations, right? They're isolated, and over time, they accumulate these different genetic changes. They become different species. The most common way this can occur is through a mechanism called allopatric speciation, right? This is where a species becomes a new species because they've been geographically isolated from their original population, right? This is in line with what we have talked about so far, right? Maybe they live on either sides of a mountain range now. Maybe like the snails, they live on either side of that chasm in the earth, right? They are geographically isolated. Right, so we've gone through many, many examples of allopatric speciation. I recognize there's more text on this slide, so I'm going to briefly pause or try to slow down. So allopatric speciation, that is the main way that we can get new species, most common method at least. Let's look at some examples. So I have a cartoon example of these chipmunks here, right? Chipmunks population is all blue in this first case. Maybe there was a flash flood, and sometimes in flash floods, rivers can change course, right? They can change their direction a little bit. So maybe the river changed direction and it now isolates out the population into two different populations, right? They've been isolated out by this river. Over time, they become adapted for the environment on either side of the river. So maybe if we're just looking at color here, we turned into like a dark pink and a light green color for their different fur types. Maybe on this side of the river, their environment was light to begin with, and this light green helps them blend in. Maybe the other side of the environment was more woody, darker environment, so the darker fur coloration helps them blend in, right? But now if these two were to meet at some point down the road, those genetic changes are so different, right, that they probably wouldn't mate with one another because we would consider them different species, right? Maybe they have some sort of behavioral differences now, or temporal differences. A good real-world example of this is the porkfish, right? They live in the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. At one point, North America and South America, they were not separated, or they were not connected by the Isthmus of Panama. But over time, this landmass, right, appeared and separated out the Pacific Ocean from the Caribbean Sea. So in the past, these two different species were likely one species because they could interact with each other on either side of the continents. But when the Isthmus of Panama arose, right, it now separated out the population. So now one population adapted to their environment, became slightly different coloration, right, maybe different behavioral patterns than the population on the other side. Right? They are now two separate species, where in the past, they were likely just one. All right, so allopatric speciation, right, really similar to what we're talking about. The other method of speciation is sympatric speciation. This is where there are no physical barriers to interbreeding. They inhabit the same geographic area. All right, so I always think about this as sympatric, same area. They both have an S to them, right? So these are populations, they live in the same area. Something else is causing a reproductive isolating mechanism to occur, right? Now, one of those mechanisms might be polyploidy, right? Polyploidy, we remember when we talked about meiosis and mitosis, specifically meiosis, when we have non-disjunction, when the chromosomes don't separate out properly, maybe all the chromosomes go to one side, leaving some gametes to have more chromosomes than usual or fewer chromosomes than usual, right? Now in mammals, this is almost always lethal, right? But in other species, like fish species or plant species, sometimes when we have abnormal situations of chromosomes, we can actually develop an entirely new line of species, right? So here we have two carp. They have bred to create a hybrid, right? This hybrid is going to breed with another species, right? And during that breeding process, right, we have some gametes that were just not reduced, right, or non-disjunction in our gametes. We are creating a new, what we call allotetraploid. It's a tetraploid species now instead of the original diploid species. But that tetraploid species survives, right? It survives, and now it's, if there's enough of them, and that population can grow, it can become a new species. All right, so again, not possible in mammals, but in fish and in plants in particular, this can be more common. All right, again, they're in the same environment, same pond, same stream, wherever they live. But we can also have a population that adapts to their local environments in different ways. So again, they're not physically separated. They're in the same area. So an example of this would be the North American apple maggot fly. Right? So this maggot fly originally fed on native hawthorn trees. Right? That was its food source. But about 200 years ago, apples were introduced to their environment. So now they have two different food sources. They have apples and they have hawthorn fruit. Right? Some flies preferred to eat the apples. Some flies preferred to eat the hawthorn fruit. Right? They had choices in their food sources. But the difference is that the apple trees tended to mature faster and produce fruit faster than the hawthorn trees. So over time, what happened is the population that preferred the apples to the hawthorns now started to have a temporal separation. Right? They started to eat their apples, move on to their reproductive cycles faster than those flies that relied on the hawthorn fruit. Right? So this resulted in a temporal isolation that can lead to two different species arising. All right, let's answer a group question here, and I don't think it's going to take us 2 minutes, so I'm going to stop us at like a 1 minute mark, kind of. But I want you to identify the two different ways of speciation, allopatric versus sympatric, and identify them on the image shown. Oh.
I was just still going to be getting kicked.
But some people, when we're just gonna start his contract for when he retires, they're still gonna be paying on it. This is just a stupid.
All right, let's talk about this question together. So let's answer the bottom question, because I think that should also answer the top question here. We have a population of trees, mostly dark green, right? And in both cases, we have that dark green population splitting into two different species. The original dark green, and then a light green population. Right? What type of speciation has occurred with this mountain range here? Allopatric. Yeah, it's all about the environment. There's some sort of geographic barrier, and in this case, it's a mountain range. Right? So maybe on this side of the mountain range, right, they just created lighter, different trees, or whatever environment factors were influencing there. All right, if this is allopatric, what is the other one?
Sympatric.
Yeah, sympatric, same environment, right? Likely, this differences in speciation arose to polyploidy because plants are known to do that. All right, any questions on this content? Oh, doesn't want to move on me. There we go. Whoa. All right, so we're gonna move on to our next topic. Population dynamics. All right, so we've talked about how a species can arise to become different species. We talked about different changes within a species. But now we want to talk about populations, right? Populations as a whole. So we are more concerned with ecology, right? So this is the interactions of different organisms with each other and their interactions with the environment, right? This is a more broader scale of looking at science, right? We're not looking at molecules under a microscope or under the scanning electron microscope anymore. Right now we're looking at more bigger picture concepts. So ecology would be the interaction with the biotic components and the abiotic components of the environment. Those biotic components being any other living organisms. Abiotic being things like climate or weather or disturbances like fire, right? So again, we're talking about individuals in a population. Right? This is like the third time we've defined population, but they rely on the same resources. They're influenced by the same environmental factors because they occupy the same area, and they can interbreed with one another. All right, so let's become population ecologists for the next few slides here. Right? If we're population ecologists, we want to measure a few different things about our populations. Right? So our population that we are studying. We want to know what is the density of these organisms. Right? So the number of organisms in a given area. Right? Maybe we have two different populations. One lives on a hillside, one lives in a grassland. Right? Are their densities different? Right? So how many individuals are in each of those areas and how much area do they occupy? We also want to look at their demography, which would be things like birth rates or death rates or how many individuals are within a certain age class. So how many are under a year? How many would be considered juveniles versus adults? Right? We also want to look at just the overall size of the population. How many individuals are there? And not only how many individuals are there, but how many individuals fall into these different size categories. Right? By looking at density and demography, it helps us make decisions about species management issues. Right? So if you go into the conservation field and you're looking at conserving a particular organism that might be endangered or going extinct, you're going to want to know what is its density, what are their demography, right? I need to understand this population so that I can help manage this population, get that population more successful, or keep that population surviving, right? We don't want them to go extinct. So how would I look at a population? How would I actually get this data, right? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do so. Mostly it's just simple visual counts, right? We have to count them up. There's going to be some math and equations involved. We're not going to go into those equations. But often this involves capture methods. So if we want to look at plant communities, right, they don't move. It's not too hard to capture plants. We would use something called a quadrant, which is basically a square of a known size, typically like a meter by meter square. You put it down on a plot of land, and within that square you calculate how many species are present and how many of each species are present. You might also look at things like, is this species full grown or is it a seedling? Right? So for plants, quadrants are very commonly used. For small insects or small mammals, you might use things like pitfall traps. So this is literally you're digging out a hole in the ground and you're waiting to see what falls in it. Right? Once they fall in it, they can't get out. So then the population ecologist will come back, take a look to see what has fallen in the hole, and again, see what species are there, maybe how many of each species, how old are the individuals in that pitfall trap, and then they'll be released, right? This does not kill the organisms. For birds, mist nets are really common. So these are nets that you might suspend between two different trees, very fine netting. And so birds can't see it, they will fly into it and get tangled. It doesn't harm the birds, it just prevents them from getting loose. So then again, a population ecologist would come along, untangle the bird, identify what is the species, how old do I think it is. For birds, a lot of times they'll put little bands on their legs to identify when they were last captured, right, or where they were seen last. And once they're done, those birds are free to go. And then we might have these live mammal traps, right? Maybe you've seen these in like animal control type of situations for like raccoons or feral cats, right? But we can use these to capture other mammals that we are interested in studying. Again, we capture it, we identify it, we let it go. Now the problem with these capture methods, in animals at least, is that sometimes they will learn to avoid a trap, right? So maybe they'll avoid trying to fall into a pitfall trap or avoid these cages that are set out. So again, we're not getting an accurate estimation of the population. Or they might actively try to seek out these traps. Maybe these traps offered a food incentive, right? Maybe they really love that food incentive. They want more, even if it means getting trapped in a cage for half a day, right? They might actively seek out these traps, which again leads to an inaccurate count. We might be overestimating how many animals or individuals are in that population. So many, many ways to try to figure out the size, demography of a population. Oftentimes when we get that data, we will put that data into what's called a life table. So this is a very large table, has a lot of numbers, and it's all the data on individuals for a particular age class. So I might say from from birth to 1 year old, right? This is how many individuals I have. Maybe these are how many have died, right? All of the information of that population for that age class. Now, males are not normally included, right? Because it's harder to follow parentage of males rather than females in a population. So we're really only looking at females in life tables. We're going to look at an example of the North American beaver. So the life table that we're going to look at, this data was collected in the 60s and 70s. Basically, fur trappers would capture their beavers, right? They would harvest them for pelts and whatnot. They would send in the mandibles of these beavers to the scientists, who would then look at features like their teeth to determine how old they were. And based on these mandibles, they came up with this life table. All right, now a lot of numbers, a lot of information. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. So first of all, we have age. How old were those beavers? Were they 1 year old? Were they 1 to 2 years old? So on and so forth. For each of those age categories, how many were alive at the start of the year? How many died during the year? We're also going to calculate age-specific survivorship rate, right? So what is their rate of surviving? As well as age-specific fertility. Now notice for age class 0 to 1, that age-specific fertility is 0, right? That means they're not mature enough to start reproducing. Once they are mature enough to start reproducing, say ages, roughly 3 to 12 here, we see these numbers above 1, right? We know that they're actively reproducing. All right, so we have all this information for each specific age class. Now, if I'm looking at a life table, I'm really paying attention to one number, and that one number is the net reproductive rate. That is calculated using all the other numbers on the table, right? And what it's telling us is the overall growth rate of a population, right? So then we're going to use the number of offspring born to females in all ages. Now we do use this equation to calculate it out. I used to have my classes calculated, but I decided against adding more math, right? So what you would do is you would take the age-specific survivorship, multiply it by the age-specific fertility, and add all those numbers together, and you would get the net reproductive rate. Now, the net reproductive rate tells us one of three things. If that number is above 1, it means our population is growing. If that number is below 1, it means it's declining. If it's exactly equal to 1, which is not often the case, that's pretty rare, it means the population is exactly at equilibrium. Right? So if I'm looking at my net reproductive rate, I'm really looking to see, is it above 1, less than 1, or equal to 1? So if we switch back to our life table, right, net reproductive rate, again, is LX times MX, which is age-specific survivorship rate times age-specific fertility. We add all of these numbers up for each age class, we get the net reproductive rate, which in this case is 0.938. So what is this net reproductive rate in this population telling us? Is the population growing, declining, or staying the same? It's declining. That number is less than 1. It's close to 1, it's 0.9. It's probably not declining super fast, but it is declining, right? So in this case, our population is actively declining. All right. Basically, what I would want you to know from the life tables is how to interpret that net reproductive rate. All right, so that leads us to some questions to answer here. I want you to answer, what does a population ecologist do? And then tell me something about the population based on its net reproductive rate.
Yeah, just not super fast, but just slowly. We're definitely good.
There's equations for a lot.
It's kind of like original or HA supported. Less than 0.05.
All right, if I were to ask you, what does a population ecologist study? What would you tell me?
Organisms with biotic and abiotic environments.
Yeah, how organisms interact with their biotic and abiotic environment. What specifically could you measure in a population?
Birth rates, death rates.
Okay, well, now.
Yeah. No, all these different factors. There's a lot of different factors. Birth rates, death rates, what their reproductive success is, right? How old are they when they reach reproductive maturity, right? So there's a lot of information that ecologists can pull out of a population. So basically, population ecologists, what do they study? Everything about a population. So if we had a population that we were studying and it had a net reproductive rate of 1.14, is this population increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? Increasing, yes, it is above 1. All right, we can apply some of these population dynamics to different survivorship curves. So this tells us the surviving individuals at each age. Now, survivorship curves are often plotted on a log scale, so that allows us to compare population sizes that are very different. So it allows us to say, compare a population that's in the hundreds of thousands to a population that is only in the hundreds, right? But what we see are 3 patterns that can emerge. The first one is a type 1 pattern, meaning we have a low rate loss of juveniles, right? Typically, these are going to be populations that don't produce a lot of children at once, right? The human population is an example of this. right? We can only have one child at once, or twins or triplets, right? But we're not having 30 children at once, right? Those children will survive, and it's not until we reach adulthood or later on in life that individuals will start to pass away. Different than type 2. Type 2 is a really uniform death rate, right? So whether you're young, whether you're in the middle part of your life, or whether you're old, right, the death rate stays the same. It is a uniform death rate. Right, so a lot of amphibians, like this lizard here, tend to exhibit this uniform type of death. And then finally we have type 3. Type 3 is where these populations might have a lot of young, right? So think about, say, fish populations. I often think of Finding Nemo when I think of this example, right? Fish tend to have lots of eggs, right, that they will keep safe in this gelatinous structure somewhere under the water, right? But they also have a lot of predators. Predators will come along and eat a lot of the fish eggs. So over time, the number of juveniles that survive is really low. Even though they started with a high number of fish eggs, we might only have a few that survive. But those that do survive, right, will typically live to be a relatively older age, right? They typically have a longer life. So high loss of juveniles, right, and then low loss for those that actually survive. All right, we can apply this to another question. So I want you to tell me, what type of survivorship curve is this? Right? And then I want you to draw what a survivorship curve would look like for an individual in a population that has a lot of offspring that do not survive.
There's a lot of and they all just die. Type 3.
It just means it's like,
Yeah, just like inverted or whatever.
I'll give this like another 30 seconds here. I have a feeling we did not need the full 2 minutes there, so we'll come back together now. What type of survivorship curve, type 1, 2, or 3, is represented there? Type 1, yeah. We have fewer juveniles that are born, but they survive to become very old. All right, maybe we have an individual that's in a population that produces a lot of offspring, but many of those offspring do not survive. What type of survivorship curve would this be? It would be 3, yeah. A lot of loss for the young, right? But those that do survive have a higher survivorship. So that curve would look something similar to what I've drawn here. Any questions about survivorship curves? All right, we're gonna keep moving on then. So, population ecology. We're not only concerned with how many individuals are born or die in a population. We're just concerned, well, not just concerned, we're also concerned with how a population increases or decreases. Now that can be through births and deaths, but that can also be through immigration and emigration. So maybe we have individuals migrating into a population, so that would increase the population size. Or we have individuals emigrating out. So they're migrating out of a population, so decreasing the population size. All right. So we need to take into account not only births and deaths, but immigration and emigration. Right? That's going to change population size. But there's also factors that can change population size. Right? Factors in the environment that can regulate how big a population can grow. So we're going to look at some of those factors in the environment. Right? Different factors might be habitat quality, right? So a low quality habitat might mean there's not a lot of different species, there's not a lot of places to build a nest or burrow or find food. Whereas a higher quality habitat likely has more species, has more variation, more places for these organisms to live, right? So habitat quality can influence population size, as well as habitat quantity. How many places are there for these populations to live? Right, so here we have a diagram of all of these occupied patches. We have 5 that are occupied, 1 that is unoccupied. Right, so there's 6 total places in this area that population can live. Right, they have options. So habitat quantity, but not only how many places they have to live, but how big is that place. So we would look at the degree of habitat fragmentation. So habitat fragmentation is where we take one habitat and break it down into 2 or multiple smaller habitats. Now, nowadays this is mostly caused by humans, right? So think about if we had a forest and we built a highway through it, right? We're now separating a large patch of forest into 2 patches of forest. Or maybe we have a new housing development going on, right? So this can make a difference because some individuals, some organisms need a large space. So in the example up here, we have some bears. They can only live where there's a large habitat. It's been broken down, if it's been broken down into 2 smaller ones, those bears can no longer survive there, right? So the size of the habitat or the degree of fragmentation makes a difference, as well as the population itself. So what is the dispersal pattern of those populations? Right? Are they just randomly dispersed? A lot of plants, they are randomly dispersed. Wherever that seed falls is where it grows. Or maybe we have a clumped distribution, where you might have a large geographic range, but at any one time, you're only inhabiting a smaller space, like these elephants here. Right? They tend to have this clumped distribution. Or maybe you have more of a uniform distribution, right? Maybe you inhabit a larger area, right? And within that larger area, you're uniformly distributed. So all these penguins here, whenever you see a group of penguins, they're not all clustered together typically. They're normally spread out over an area, right? Very uniformly. So different environmental factors are affecting the population size. All right, so we have different environmental factors affecting the population size, and we can look at how these environmental factors change how a population grows. So by looking at a population, we could say that it either has exponential growth or logistic growth. All right, these would be 2 models for growth. Exponential growth says that resources in the environment is not limiting. There are plenty of resources. That population can just keep on increasing in size, right? There is no end in sight, essentially. So it might mean we have a wolf with plenty of prey options of these rabbits, right? It could exhibit exponential growth. Resources are not limiting. But now say that population of rabbits declines, and now there's only a few rabbits in the area, right? This population of wolves is going to be capped at how big it can get. It's going to exhibit logistic growth because now the resources are limited, right? There's not enough resources to sustain this population to keep on growing. Once a population gets too big, it's going to start to die back because there's just not enough resources to sustain it. All right, so resource limitation is linked to population growth. Let's look at some examples of this exponential growth, right? This is kind of less common in nature, right? Often we see resources being limited, but there are instances where resources are not limited to a population. One of those could be when we reintroduce a population to a habitat. So for example, wolves in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, right? Their population was relatively low. Then we reintroduced the wolves into Yellowstone National Park, right? In this area, the habitat was huge, plenty of resources, right? There is nothing inhibiting the growth of this population. We can see that population skyrocketed, right? It exhibits exponential growth here. Now, another example of exponential growth is introduced exotic species. So the Burmese pythons, they are not native to Florida. They were introduced, and they're introduced as like pets that people either released or escaped. But when they were escaped or reintroduced to the environment, right, they found that they could thrive. They had so many resources available to them. They didn't have any natural predators. Their population exploded in the wild in Florida. To the point where now people go out and hunt these Burmese pythons down because they're actually pretty detrimental to the natural environment around them because there's just so many of them. They take up and use a lot of resources. And then finally, the human population. We're an example of exponential growth. Now, not every population and community on Earth could say this, right? But as a whole, humans have a lot of resources available to us, right? We can exhibit exponential growth. We have a lot of significant advances in medicine and science and technology that allows our population to exponentially grow. All right, so those are examples of exponential growth. Let's look at logistic growth, which is more common. Logistic growth is capped based on the resources. Right? So basically, for most species, resources are going to grow limiting as the population increases in size. Right? What's limiting the population in the environment, we would say, is the carrying capacity. Right? That is the maximum population size that can be supported by an environment. Right? So once we reach a carrying capacity, that population is going to plateau. It's no longer going to increase. Again, there's an equation here, and again, I'm not going to expect you to know this equation. But what I did want to point out is that carrying capacity plays a huge role here. Right? We calculate that into our equation. So factors that limit a population in growing, factors that play into carrying capacity, might be limiting food options, or maybe nutrients are limiting, especially in plants. If we are limited in nutrients, we can't grow as many plants. Maybe there's fewer places to nest or hide from predators, right? So there's a lot of different resources that can be limiting in a population. And one thing I want to note before we end today's lecture, because this is the last bit of the content check that you'll turn on Wednesday, right, is that there's variations in this carrying capacity. What might hold true one year in one environment might not be the same the next year. So maybe one year we have this population of deer, plenty of grass for them to graze upon. Maybe next year there's a massive drought. There's not as much grass. That carrying capacity is now lower than it was before. So this can vary. This can vary between year to year and environment to environment. And it's often density dependent, right? So it's dependent on how many are in the population. We'll pick up on this slide, but one thing I wanted to point out is that you can see in this graph here that we have this growth that is rapid, but once we reach this carrying capacity, we start to plateau out, right? All right, we'll pick up on this slide when we come back on Wednesday for our last day of content. And don't forget there are a couple of assignments due.